cultural heritage stripped away from you without your consent. As a commodity bought and sold for profit, accepted in a similar way to property rights for land theft. The doctrine of discovery and domination set a foundation of targeted destruction, and the current trend of international policies and regulations is to use dominant worldviews to colonize remaining unexplored aspects of the natural world. Leading Indigenous representatives continue to combat the piracy of the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, as they struggle to keep up with the fast-paced and costly negotiations of the international arena. Whether we confront global issues of climate change-related disasters, the decline of peak oil production, water crises, loss of biodiversity, or food security dilemmas that shape versions of the development in the current state system. It is clear that empire, including biocolonialism of WIPO, it undermines the survival of needs of the world population and generations to come. Indigenous nations and peoples' rights upheld at the international level make it necessary to support collectively held knowledge, land and resource rights, and at the same time, acknowledge that these rights are inherent and inalienable. The basis for the rights of Indigenous nations and peoples is the right to self-determination, combined with the right to free, prior, and informed consent, with the purpose of benefiting Mother Earth and creation. If the issue of biocolonialism is to be resolved, then systems that set agendas to deny essential human rights from Indigenous nations and peoples, including WIPO, must be invalidated. The North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus recommends, number 1, delegates active in the World Intellectual Property Organization's, WIPO, Intergovernmental Committee, IGC, on genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and folklore. Provided an overview on the issues that have been occurring in the WIPO IGC meetings and processes that have undermined the rights and participation of Indigenous peoples, and are attempting to commodify and commercialize Indigenous knowledge, medicine, and other traditional practices. Number 2, on February 20th of 2012, nearly all of the Indigenous delegates in attendance decided to withdraw from active participation in the WIPO negotiations because the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to participate as equals in the negotiations continues to be denied. Indigenous peoples have seen a continual process of diminishing Indigenous peoples' participation in key small working groups, and our text proposals require the support of at least one state to remain on the table. Without that support, Indigenous peoples' proposals are ignored. The single most significant demand by Indigenous peoples is that WIPO amend its rules of procedure to ensure the full and equal participation of Indigenous peoples in all processes that affect us. Until that change happens, we cannot conscientiously participate in a process that will continue to undermine the rights of Indigenous peoples and threaten our future generations. Number 3, Indigenous peoples from across North America expressed their outrage at the current negotiations under the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee, the IGC, on intellectual property and genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and folklore, which fail to recognize Indigenous rights, thereby forcing Indigenous peoples to withdraw from the negotiations. They stress that WIPO has no legitimacy and right to deal with issues related to traditional knowledge. Number 4, the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus is concerned that there are a small number of Indigenous organizations, some state-funded, that appear willing to participate in the WIPO process. The North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus recommends that WIPO be requested to use the proper term Indigenous peoples, since that they are part of the UN interordinate agency task with implementing the UN draft throughout the United Nations. Number 6, NAPIC recommends that the UNPFII make it clear to WIPO that they do not have the support of Indigenous peoples when they appear before the permanent forum before a clear and vocal and unanimous message. NAPIC calls on the UNPFII and the United Nations to investigate WIPO and its current negotiations under the IGC on issues of Indigenous peoples' participation, and need to take into account Indigenous peoples' rights to participation. NAPIC recommends that the United Nations make it clear to WIPO that they cannot regulate Indigenous TK and access to such associated genetic resources, and that those remain under the control of Indigenous peoples. NAPIC recommends that UNPFII and the United Nations call for dismantling the WIPO IGC negotiations, and to instead mandate negotiations under UNPFII or the CBD to develop international mechanisms to protect Indigenous systems for regulating access to traditional knowledge and genetic resources as a protected such. NAPIC recommends that the research on free trade be done, including world trade agreements. NAPIC also recommends that the alternative funding mechanism be established so that the NAPIC can have representatives at the WIPO meetings to observe and report back on matters taking place in WIPO. NAPIC recommends that Indigenous nations and peoples set their own legal standards for the protection of our traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources, and the UN must inform WIPO that it must respect Indigenous peoples' laws on these issues. Thank you for your time.